Cecilia, I want to go back to something that Temir mentioned earlier on, and that is President Trump taking advantage of conservative governments in Latin America, governments in Argentina, in Peru, in Colombia, to build some kind of coalition against Venezuela. Do you think that's what's happening?
Well, I think that this trip clearly shows that the U.S. is trying to regain influence in Latin America. There are some interesting surveys that show, for example, the Latinobarometro survey that shows that the support for the Trump administration, or the view of the Trump administration, got a 2.7 over 10 points last December, which is clearly the lowest number since 2005. So there's a lot of concern in the U.S. of this loss of influence in the region, and this trip is part of that. And it's true. Now, recently, the Trump administration has found very friendly governments throughout the region, and they are not only rallying them to support action in relation with Venezuela and Cuba, but also at the United Nations. Some countries supported or voted or abstained in the U.S. In relation with the U.S. decision linked to Jerusalem. And more generally, there's a very significant group of countries like Argentina, like Peru, like Brazil right now, that are very much aligned with the United States. I think that what shows also Tillerson's speech is that they are very concerned about China's influence in the region and elsewhere. It's not coincidence that they take on so strongly with China right before going to Latin America. This is clearly the main priority and concern for the US. And I think they did in a very cynical way and probably neglecting history and the history of US involvement in the region, and how good I think it is for Latin America to diversify the sources of trade, of funding, of investment, not only with China, with all countries around the world. As a region, I think we need more multilateral, multi-global cooperation with the rest of the world.
Go ahead, Ken.
I think Latin American countries these days, most of them anyway, I mean, don't need much prodding from the US to do something about Venezuela. I think most people and most governments in Latin America find what's happening in Venezuela abhorrent and unacceptable. So the question there is a different one. The question there is whether any kind of help from the US, the current US administration, actually helps that. I would think that it's actually counterproductive. I mean, even conservative presidents in Latin America would have to tread very, very carefully in their relationship with the current US administration that is deeply, deeply unpopular in Latin America. I mean, I would be hard-pressed to name one president in Latin America that would be happy to appear in the same picture frame with Donald Trump.
Well, you know, now that you mentioned that, there's a headline in the Washington Post, and let's talk about another country that's having problems with the United States right now, and that is Mexico. The headline in the Washington Post said, Rex Tillerson visits Mexico as bilateral ties hit their lowest point in years. And we know that President Trump has been talking about Mexico right from the beginning of the election campaign. He slammed Mexico for drugs. He called immigrants all kind of derogatory names. He slammed it for trade. He wants to blow up NAFTA. It's happened with other countries too, hasn't it? The bad relations.
Sure, but not to the extent that it's happening with Mexico. I think the rhetoric coming out of President Trump's mouth has been particularly insulting, I mean, with regards to Mexico. And I have the impression that particularly the wall, I mean, the notion of building a wall, it's something that irks not just Mexicans, but Latin Americans in general. And it would be, you know, tragic to replace what for a long time was a sore point in the relationship between the U.S. and Latin America, that is the Cuban embargo, with something arguably as insulting as that. I mean, it would be deeply counterproductive into U.S. policy and to U.S. influence in Latin America.
Cecilia?
Yeah, I find it hard to understand why there are so many Latin American governments that are so excited about meeting up with Trump, about celebrating the relationship with the U.S. at this particular moment, with the Trump administration being so unpopular, with all the attacks against Mexico, against Venezuela so strongly, against some other countries in the region, with the anti-immigrant policies affecting people from Haiti, people from El Salvador. But it seems there's something, an ideological interest, a business interest in these governments in the region that still make them be very close and very aligned with the Trump administration. It's hard to understand. And in fact, they have been very reluctant. In the case of the government of Argentina, for example, the Macri government, they've been very reluctant to develop strong win-win relations with China, also with Russia, also with India, I mean, other countries. And most importantly, they have debilitated, they have really built a very difficult moment for intra-Latin American relations. We used to be, and I celebrate that, we used to be a region with very strong relations. And this is very important. There's no way you can relate with the US or with China or with Europe from a position of strength if you're not united as Latin American countries. And unfortunately, this is not going today. The UNASUR, the CELAC, all the regional bodies are very debilitated. I don't blame this on Trump. I think this is most importantly part of the region's responsibility, but certainly the US is giving a hand on that.
Benjamin, notwithstanding the growing Chinese relationship with Latin America, mainly a trade relationship, there is a view, and it may just be a perception, that the United States has lost influence in Latin America. Is the United States not trying to play catch-up?
I mean, I think the economic phenomenon of China is undeniable, and I think any rational Latin American government that sees the opportunity for that level of financing to come to meet infrastructure needs is going to accept it. And I think the diminishing relative influence of the United States, again, is inevitable. I think the phenomenon we're seeing in the Trump era is extremely distinct, and it relates to the unpopularity of this administration. In places like Argentina, where the US government now has the support of 13% of the population, it was 20 percentage points higher just a year ago. So I don't think it's inevitable that the decline will happen at this speed. I think there must be room for other extra-regional actors like China. I think the United States could recapture a lot of the support it has lost with a more reasonable and rational approach to the region. I think, as Kevin pointed out earlier, there are cultural affinities. I think the Chinese political model is unpopular and unpalatable to a lot of Latin Americans who have struggled to obtain democratic systems in the region. I think the United States is still the key economic partner for many of the countries as well. So I think what we're seeing right now, this acceleration of the loss of prestige and influence, would have happened at a much slower pace and could be recovered in a new administration in the United States.
Temir, what do you think? Can the United States recapture the influence that it had in Latin America, as Benjamin points out? I mean, what does it look like for someone sitting in Caracas, say? What does the United States have to do to recapture that influence?
Well, one has to remember that, economically speaking, Latin American countries remain mainly commodity exporters, and you know, as a consequence of that, in the last few years, China has become the main recipient of most of Latin American commodities. And I would again quote the example of countries like Paraguay or Uruguay, who have two different political orientations as when it refers to their governments, and they have developed greatly their exports to China, and China has become the main recipient of their exports. So this is, I would say, a global trend that has pushed, in a way, Latin America towards China, and also the opposite. But there is a second ingredient, and to answer your question, is that China's approach to the region, and you know, this is also the official line of the Chinese government, has been that of a bilateral cooperation between developing countries. Chinese government doesn't meddle into internal affairs. Chinese government does not make an opinion of each and every political move that happens in Latin American countries, and Latin American countries are extremely sensitive to that. These are countries also that have greatly suffered in the past of foreign interventions, mostly coming from the United States in the 20th century, from Europe in the 19th century. So what it takes to develop, I would say, a balanced relationship with Latin American countries is, one, respect, a balanced approach, and also, again, understanding the changing, the changes in the Latin American economies that, again, are turning towards the east because they find there commercial agreements and markets that are ready to be the recipients of their exports.
All right. Kevin, you want to respond to that?
I mean, I guess you can make a virtue out of necessity, you know. I would hesitate to call the approach towards bilateral cooperation used by the Chinese, which is the approach of no questions asked. I would hesitate to call that virtuous. I mean, my impression is, and not only in Latin America.
And the Chinese would say it's a domestic issue. These are internal
Well,
affairs.
I mean, yes, but you know, from looking from the other standpoint, one could also say that there are value issues that are important, and not just to the specific country that we might be talking about. I mean, that there are international norms about respect for human rights, for instance, that should be upheld and defended. And it so happens, and not just in Latin America, that those countries that are more sensitive, to use the same word that was used here, sensitive to external criticism, are those countries that happen to flout those rules with and those principles of human rights with impunity.
Benjamin, did you want to say something?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I think the region, again, to look at the Barack Obama administration, which was quite popular in Latin America, generating huge, adoring crowds when it traveled to Brazil, to Argentina, as you referenced earlier, defended these norms that Kevin references frequently. I mean, there was agreements on global issues as well, on migration, on climate change, on Cuba, but on trade, which have all now shifted, and that's another reason for the dissonance in the relationship. But I think there was no hesitation to support environmental regulations, labor regulations. So I don't think that's a prerequisite for strong relations in the region whatsoever.
I'm rapidly running out of time. I've got a minute, Cecilia.
Yeah, I can add my personal experience negotiating with both the United States and China at different moments. And as Latin Americans, it was very refreshing to relate with China in many ways as in relation with our bilateral relationship, because they were very respectful of our political system. Of course, we don't want, as Latin Americans, to be the backyard of anybody. I don't think we should try to reimpose any type of Monroe Doctrine in any way. It was fortunately declared over by the former Secretary of State, Sean Kerry, in relation with the US and Latin America, and I think this is a good lesson. I mean, we don't need any type of regional, extra-regional influence or hegemony in the region. But I can certify that in terms of the bilateral dealings, it was a refreshing approach in terms of diversification of our foreign policy and really getting to funds and to access in a time in which it was in need.
And regrettably, we're going to have to leave it there. We didn't even get to Cuba. Thanks to all of you for being with us.